Wealth doesn't vanish during a market crash. It merely changes its zip code. While the middle class is encouraged to hold on to depreciating assets to save the economy, institutional giants are executing a different contract entirely, a structural rebalancing where your equity becomes their inventory. They aren't fearing the next recession. They are scheduling it, treating the collapse of your world as a clinical procurement window for the next great transfer of wealth. This is the silent architecture of the harvest, a process where the elite transition from being participants in the expansion to becoming the landlords of the contraction. To see the machinery in motion, we must look past the headlines and into the office of a man named Julian, who did everything the system asked of him, only to realize that while he was building a life on sand, the elite were already signing the deeds to his horizon. The destruction of Julian's world was not a failure of the system. It was the system functioning exactly as designed. Most people view a recession as a natural disaster, a sudden and unpredictable storm that levels everything in its path without prejudice. We are told that when the market crashes, everyone loses. We are told that wealth simply evaporates into the ether. This is the official narrative, and it is fundamentally incomplete. Wealth does not vanish. It merely changes address. What we are witnessing in these cycles is not a crisis, but a structural rebalancing, a period of massive wealth transfer that the financial elite treat as a procurement window. Think about what that means. While the middle class is encouraged to hold on to depreciating equities or maintain consumption to save the economy, institutional funds and high net worth individuals are executing a different contract. They are moving into what I call structural liquidity. This is the calculated transition from paper wealth to the ownership of essential nodes in the global infrastructure. It is the move from being a participant in the expansion to being a landlord of the contraction. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a cold analysis of capital flow. Historical data from 1929, 2008, and 2020 confirms a recurring pattern of predatory efficiency. The elite do not just wait for the collapse. They use the pre-recession period to deleverage, to exit volatile markets, and to build an inventory of survival. They are looking for assets that remain necessary when the world stops spending. To understand how this harvest is conducted, we must look past the headlines and examine the 10 specific asset classes that capture value when everything else is failing. These are the defensive shields that become offensive weapons once the blood is in the water. We are going to look at how they move into 4-week treasury bills, why they hoard physical gold, and how they eventually become the bank when the traditional banks fail. Let me be precise about the mechanics of this capture. Here is how the inventory is built. To understand why Julian lost everything, you must first understand how the machinery of the global economy is actually built. Most people believe that a recession is a sudden failure of the engine, but the truth is far more clinical. A recession is a scheduled cleaning of the filter. We are taught that wealth evaporates during a crash, as if the dollars simply dissolve into the air. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of the law of conservation of capital. Wealth does not vanish, it merely transitions from a state of participation to a state of capture. Consider the concept of fractional reserve banking. Here is what that means in the context of a harvest. The system operates on the assumption that everyone will not ask for their money at the same time. It is a game of musical chairs where the music is the expansion of credit. When the music stops, the chairs are not removed by accident. They are bought by those who knew the length of the song. While Julian was encouraged to reinvest his profits into more trucks, and a bigger home institutional players were achieving what I call structural liquidity. Structural liquidity is the calculated ability to remain unentangled when the market hardens. Think of the economy as a vast sieve. In the expansion phase, the holes are small and everyone feels supported. But as the cycle turns, the holes widen. Small businesses and individual savings fall through because they are tied to paper valuations that require a buyer to exist. The elite, however, have already moved into assets that do not require a functioning market to maintain their utility. They have transitioned from being the fuel of the machine to being the owners of the pump. They use the pre-recession period for deleveraging, which simply means they eliminate their own debt, while the middle class is still being sold the dream of cheap credit. By the time the panic hits, they are not victims of the crash, but the only ones with the keys to the vault. You might believe that government regulations, or deposit insurance, are designed to prevent this kind of systemic extraction. That is a reasonable assumption, and we will examine exactly how those protections function in a moment. But first, we must look at the specific inventory the wealthy build, while the rest of the world is still celebrating. I promise to examine how the protections you trust actually perform when the harvest begins. To do that, we must look at the wreckage of 2008. This was not a theoretical exercise for the 9 million Americans who lost their jobs or the nearly 10 million who saw their homes enter foreclosure. While Julian sat in his Illinois office, watching his phone stop ringing, the global financial system was experiencing a literal cardiac arrest. $25 trillion of household wealth evaporated. This was the clinical extraction of value from the middle class on a scale never before documented in the modern era. In the United States, 465 banks failed in the 4 years following the crash. Each failure represented thousands of Julians. It was not just a domestic storm. Consider the textile worker in Dhaka who suddenly found herself without the $95 a month she needed to feed her family because the stores in Chicago were empty. Or the copper miner in Chile who watched the price of his labor collapse in a single afternoon. For these individuals, the recession was a lived catastrophe. But for the institutional players, it was the moment the sieve began to work. The elite had already moved into the inventory of survival. While the general public was told to stay the course and trust the long-term average of the market, the structural players were already purchasing the distressed debt that would eventually own the very houses Julian and his neighbors were losing. They were not losing wealth, they were acquiring the future rights to your shelter and your utility. Failure was unthinkable until it happened. This is the first time we see the pattern clearly. The institutions that were supposed to be the guardians of stability became the mechanisms of transfer. By late 2009, the authorities stepped in. We were given the Dodd-Frank Act and the promise of a safer banking system with higher capital requirements and expanded deposit insurance. The public was told that the holes in the sieve had been closed and that a disaster of this magnitude could never happen again. We were given the gift of perceived safety. Think about what that means. Now you might say that the lessons of the past have been learned and that the legislative architecture of the modern financial system is designed to prevent another mass extraction. You might point to the Dodd-Frank Act or the Basel III requirements as proof that the banking engine has been rebuilt with reinforced steel. It is a comforting thought. It suggests that the holes in the sieve have been soldered shut. But there is a fundamental difference between a safer system and a more concentrated one. In reality, the regulations introduced after 2008 did not eliminate risk. They merely moved it into the shadows where you cannot see it. Let me be precise about the nature of this perceived safety. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation is the primary shield for the American depositor. It is the institution that promises your money is safe up to $250,000. But consider the actual math of that promise. As of the latest reporting cycles, the Deposit Insurance Fund, which is the actual pool of cash available to cover failed banks, holds a reserve ratio of approximately 1.25% of all insured deposits. This is not a secret. It is a matter of public record. For every $100 you have in the bank, the insurance fund holds $1.25. If a systemic failure occurs, the shield is not a wall, but a veil. Think about what that means. The system is not designed to protect the total volume of your savings. It is designed to prevent a psychological panic while the structural rebalancing takes place. While you were taught to trust the expanded insurance limits, the financial elite were watching the migration of credit. Since the last crash, we have seen the explosive growth of what economists call private credit. This is a $1.7 trillion market where institutions like BlackRock and Oaktree Capital lend money directly to corporations. Because these are not traditional banks, they operate outside the very regulations designed to protect you. They have become the bank without the burden of being the utility. When the traditional lending window slams shut during a contraction, these private lenders do not fail. They thrive. They charge premium interest rates to desperate but viable businesses that the regulated banks can no longer serve. This is the ultimate form of structural capture. It is the transition from being a participant in a regulated market to being the owner of the private gate. While the public is focused on the safety of their local branch, the elite have already built a parallel infrastructure that bypasses the sieve entirely. This brings us to the final and most sophisticated layer of the harvest. If the banking system itself is a fragile shell, the elite have moved their focus to the ownership of the underlying rights to your life. They are no longer just buying the debt, they are buying the royalties of your existence. We must now examine how the inventory of survival moves into the realm of intellectual property and strategic real estate, where the rent is collected, regardless of who holds the office of the president or the value of the dollar. Now that we know why the traditional safety net fails, we must look at what actually survives. That was the history of 2008. This is the reality of right now. We are told that the system has been fixed and that the guardrails are secure, but the evidence suggests a different trajectory. In early 2024, Berkshire Hathaway reached a record cash position of $189 billion. This is not merely a number on a balance sheet. It is a strategic withdrawal from the active equity market. One of the most successful institutional players in history has effectively stopped buying companies and started buying 4-week treasury bills. They are currently receiving yields above 5% to simply wait. Think about what that means. The elite are being paid by the government to remain liquid, while the general public is still being sold the narrative of a soft landing. They are building a wall of structural liquidity while you are encouraged to stay the course. Consider the events of March 2023. Silicon Valley Bank evaporated in exactly 48 hours. It was the second largest bank failure in the history of the United States, and it occurred with a speed that the regulatory architecture could not comprehend. This was the result of what economists call duration mismatch, which simply means the bank held long-term assets while its customers demanded short-term cash. The holes in the sieve did not just widen, they tore open. In 1929, the panic spread by telegraph and word of mouth over months. In 2008, it moved through wire services over weeks. In 2023, it moved at the speed of a smartphone notification in 2 days. Failure was unthinkable until it happened. This is the third time we have seen this pattern in a century. It is no longer an observation of history, but a law of structural mechanics. The mechanism of extraction is active, and it is more efficient than ever before. While you are encouraged to buy the dip, the institutional funds are looking at a commercial real estate market that is facing a $2 trillion maturity wall. They are looking at rising delinquency rates in credit cards and auto loans that have reached levels not seen since the great financial crisis. They are not predicting a storm, they are preparing for a procurement window. They know that when the credit cycle turns, the distressed assets of the middle class become the strategic inventory of the elite. You might believe that the regulations introduced after the last crash have made your savings untouchable. But the Deposit Insurance Fund still holds approximately $1.25 for every $100 of insured deposits. The shield is still a veil. The risk has not been eliminated. It has simply migrated into the $1.7 trillion private credit market where shadow lenders operate without the burden of public oversight. They have become the bank without the utility. They are the new harvesters. We must now examine the 10 specific asset classes that comprise this inventory of survival. We must look at the exact nodes of the global infrastructure they are acquiring while the rest of the world is still celebrating. This is how they move from being participants in the expansion to being the owners of the contraction. And here is where it gets uncomfortable. We have examined 10 distinct asset classes from 4-week treasury bills to private water utilities, but to see them as a mere collection of investments is to miss the underlying architecture of the entire system. There is a single unifying principle that connects everything we have discussed, and it is what I call the inventory of survival. This is not a strategy for growth. It is a strategy for structural capture. Think about what that means. In the expansion phase of the cycle, everyone is encouraged to chase the narrative of appreciation. You are told to buy the equity of companies that might be profitable in a decade. You are told to value your wealth based on the price someone else might pay for your house in a rising market. This is what the elite call paper wealth. It is a derivative of optimism, but the financial elite operate on a different contract. They know that paper wealth requires a functioning market to exist. They know that in a crisis, a buyer is a luxury. While Julian was building his construction firm based on the expansion of credit, the institutional players were identifying the essential nodes of the global infrastructure. They were not looking for what would grow. They were looking for what cannot fail to be used. This is the distinction between participation and ownership. Most people are participants in the machine. They provide the labor and they pay the interest. The elite are the owners of the pump. This is the deepest layer of the mechanism. A recession is not a failure of the engine. It is the clinical repossessing of the foundations. When the credit cycle turns and the paper wealth evaporates, the essential nodes do not disappear. The water still flows. The medicine is still required. The farmland still produces. The only thing that changes is the name on the title. The harvest is the moment when the ownership of these nodes moves from the many who were entangled to the few who remained liquid. This is not a conspiracy theory. This is structural analysis. It is the formalization of a process where risk is distributed to the public, while the rights to the future are concentrated in private hands. You were taught that the stock market is the engine of wealth, but for the structural player, the market is merely a distraction. The real game is played in the administrative graph of the economy. It is the ownership of the royalties of your existence. Convenience and safety are not the same thing. They are often opposites. The convenience of a digital account and a diversified portfolio is the very thing that makes your wealth easy to capture when the sieve opens. The inventory of survival is by definition inconvenient. It is tangible, it is inelastic, it is decoupled from the industrial production of the masses. You cannot freeze a relationship, and you cannot impose capital controls on the ownership of a physical necessity. We have now dismantled every layer of the illusion. We have seen that the banking system is a veil, and that the regulations are a distraction. We have identified the 10 shields that the elite turn into swords. The question is no longer what is happening. The pattern is already in motion. The only question that remains is where you stand when the music stops and the names on the titles begin to change. So what does this mean in practice? How do you translate this forensic analysis into a functional framework for your own survival? The realization that the system functions as a sieve is often paralyzing, but understanding the mechanism is the first step toward finding an alternative path. We must move from the question of what to buy to the more fundamental question of how to structure your exposure. I am not recommending these paths. I am documenting that they have happened and that they represent the primary shields used by those who emerged from the previous harvests with their autonomy intact. The first pillar is the pursuit of structural liquidity. This often means holding 4-week treasury bills or cash equivalents that provide a modest yield while maintaining the ability to move instantly. The advantage is clear. You have the dry powder to act when the market hardens and assets become distressed. The limitation, however, is that cash is a melting ice cube in a high inflation environment. If the contraction is accompanied by currency debasement, your liquidity becomes its own form of loss. There is no perfect shelter. The second pillar is the acquisition of non-correlated tangible assets. This includes physical gold or productive farmland. These assets are decoupled from the industrial production of the masses and do not require a functioning stock exchange to retain their utility. The advantage is the removal of counterparty risk. You own the node itself. The limitation is the burden of management and the inherent illiquidity. You cannot easily trade a hectare of soil for basic needs in a moment of acute panic. The third pillar is the ownership of the administrative graph. This involves looking at instruments tied to essential infrastructure like water, energy, and medical utilities. These are the royalties of existence. The advantage is inelastic demand. The limitation is that these sectors are often heavily regulated and subject to political intervention when the social contract begins to fray. Anyone who tells you there is a risk-free escape is selling something. Every alternative path involves a redistribution of risk rather than its elimination. You are choosing which type of failure you can tolerate. We are not looking for a guaranteed profit, but a way to ensure that when the names on the titles begin to change, your name is not the one being erased. Think about what that means as we return to the final chapter of Julian's story. Imagine Julian today. He is 65 years old. He is no longer the owner of a construction firm. He does not own 4 trucks or a 20-person crew. He lives in a clean, well-maintained apartment complex in suburban Illinois. The landscaping is manicured. The roof is new. But Julian does not own the roof. He pays rent to a property management firm that is a subsidiary of a real estate investment trust, which is itself owned by one of the institutional funds we have analyzed. Julian is alive. He is housed. He is not among the worst off. But he has been transformed from a participant in the expansion into a permanent line item in the inelastic cash flow of another. The wealth he thought he possessed in 2007 did not evaporate. It was simply readdressed. It moved from his paper assets into the strategic inventory of those who understood the difference between a market and a mechanism. Think about what that means. There is a fundamental difference between access and ownership. Access can be revoked. Convenience and safety are not the same thing. They are often opposites. While Julian was chasing the narrative of appreciation, the elite were securing the ownership of the nodes he now pays to use every month. The recession did not destroy wealth. It clinically repossessed the foundations of his life. This is the reality of the harvest. It is a scheduled cleaning of the filter. This channel exists to study the structural fractures before they become geological fault lines. If you want to understand the mechanisms that operate beneath the surface of the global economy, subscribe and join our study of these patterns. I am not recommending a path. I am documenting a recurring historical contract. The patterns I have described are not predictions of a distant future. They are the protocols of the present. The music is slowing down, and the names on the titles are already beginning to change. The pattern is already in motion.